key lesson that Bryce drew was that no matter how we draft the Constitution, in fact, the way it works in practice will depend on the character of the people.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Anyone who has read the Australian Constitution will appreciate just how utilitarian it is. It lacks the idealism and grandiosity of the US Constitution, which speaks of we the people forming a more perfect union. But deliberately, Australia's constitutional draftsmen, and yes, they were all men, kept sentiment in the constitutional document to a minimum. They relied on the unspoken assumptions of the Westminster tradition to breathe life into the dry bones of political architecture. But did this mean that Australia's founders lacked imagination? Or did they believe that legal machinery alone does not make a democracy? Ultimately, it is the people who determine the health of a nation's democratic life, not merely the mechanics. Now, Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister, agreed with this sentiment. He likened the parliamentary system to a musical instrument that would produce nothing but crashing discords unless the person playing it was able to capture the spirit of the music. Now, there have been some recent attempts to incorporate more aspirational language, including in 1999 at a referendum to insert a preamble written by the poet Les Murray. Unfortunately, for those in favour of that change, 60.7% of Australia's population who were allowed to vote voted no to this proposal, and so it failed. Now, as Australia's democracy faces the challenges of the 21st century, it's time to reflect on whether we still strike the right balance between mechanics and democratic character. And joining me to discuss all this is Dr. Ben Saunders, an Associate Professor of Law at Deakin Law School. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Ben.
Thanks so much, Georgina.
It's great to have you here. I, of course, have a personal connection to the Constitution because my great-grandfather was one of the South Australian delegates to the Constitutional Conventions, John Downer, who was Premier of South Australia. Not that it's required reading in our family, but we at least have that level of connection and interest. It is very dry. Some might even say it's a bit boring, but why do you think our constitutional draftsmen took the approach of such a minimalist and particularly uninspiring document? And I think in particular because you could see alternatives out there like the US Constitution.
Yeah, so the Australian Constitution is often considered to be fairly dull and uninspiring, as you mentioned, in comparison to the United States Constitution, which has grand declarations of rights and the pursuit of life, liberty and happiness and things like that. So we don't have much that's comparable in Australia. It's not that those things are completely absent. So, for example, in the preamble to the Constitution, it does say that the people, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth. So there are ideals there of religion forming the basis and federalism. So they're not completely absent. And it's also true, so I had the misfortune of reading the convention debates as part of my PhD research, which is a long and difficult exercise. But there are lots of statements in there about Australia having been a colonial dependency for 100 or so years, and now Australia is becoming a nation. It's throwing off its infancy. It's becoming an adult or becoming a man in the language of the time and taking its place among the nations of the earth and being an example of democracy and liberty and things like that. So those things aren't entirely absent. They do exist around the time of the formation of the Constitution, but very few were expressly incorporated into the text of the Constitution. And so that illustrates one key point, which is that in this, as in so many other things, the Constitution is the tip of an iceberg. So it assumes a lot of things without expressly stating them. And so it does assume a lot of those ideals which the framers held, but without expressly incorporating them. And I think one reason for that is you could think of it as a form of constitutional humility. So the framers were very conscious that they were writing their constitution in the 1890s, and the text of the document that they produced would have to last for decades, if not centuries. And they were conscious that things have evolved since the colonisation of Australia in terms of circumstances and beliefs, and they will continue to evolve and change over coming years. And so they wanted to create a document that was flexible and enabled the people of Australia to govern themselves as they saw fit. So key to their view was popular sovereignty. It's not trying to introduce rigidity into the Constitution, but allowing flexibility for the people of Australia to change the way they govern themselves from time to time.
So language around, pride in the nation, beauty, idealism, philosophical notions of rights, were they debated as to whether they should be incorporated or not? Or did the draftsman just think, well, it's not really relevant in the Australian circumstance?
So ideas of rights were certainly debated. So Andrew Inglis Clark was a very influential framer and drafted the initial draft of the first 1891 draft Constitution Bill. So he pushed strongly for there to be rights incorporated into the Constitution. That was voted down. Other ideals like beauty.
And what was the basis of voting it down?
Well, the main reason was that under the American system, there's a much stronger constitutionally entrenched set of rights that the courts can enforce, whereas that was considered inappropriate under the British model of constitutionalism. So under the British model, questions of rights are really matters for the political process to work out, so Parliament and the people, rather than being enforced in the courts. So, for example, we all agree that freedom of speech is a good thing. We all agree that we should have it. Most of us agree that it should be limited in some ways. But what are the limits on freedom of speech? So should my right to freedom of speech have the right to say offensive things about people? What about the right to say offensive things about people on racial grounds? So things like that are considered to be political questions for Parliament to work out and strike that balance, not for the courts to do so. So that's the main reason, to trust in the British model of political constitutionalism to work out those clashes of rights.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the US Constitution, but then also the British Constitution, which is an unwritten constitution, were so influential, but then were often at odds with each other in how they conceived of rights and freedoms and political structures. And so how did our draftsmen synthesise those competing approaches to come up with what we ended up with?
Sure. So it's often referred to as the Westminster mutation.
Yeah.
So you have the Washington, American ideas of federalism, and then the British, Westminster ideas of responsible government or parliamentary democracy, and they were mashed together. So we have a strong Senate, a strong upper house, which was supposed to represent the states. That's the federal idea, and the British model of responsible government, where the lower house determines the composition of the executive.
Do you think we are permanently sceptical of idealistic expressions of, love of country and sort of rights and freedoms and framing our history inside the Constitution? Like we saw in 1999, this rejection of it was a quite lovely preamble that Les Murray had written, but it completely bombed. 60.7% of the Australian population voted against it.
Yeah, there's certainly a strong strand of pragmatism in Australian culture, which is much less the case, for example, in America. So in America, there's a very strong sense of patriotism and nationalism, flags flying everywhere. You just don't get that to the same extent in Australia. So I'm not sure exactly what accounts for that. And the notion of cultural cringe has been where we're the bridesmaid to the United Kingdom, for example. Perhaps that explains it. I'm not sure, but certainly a strong strand of pragmatism and suspicion of strong ideology and things like that.
So our Constitution is very technical. So it's quite straightforward in a lot of ways. Of course, the High Court has made it less straightforward, and there's a lot of criticism of implied rights that the High Court has found in the Constitution that black letter lawyers would say aren't there. And this is an instance of judicial activism. But this idea, as I said in my introduction, that we can have the mechanics written down in the Constitution, but it's actually this idea of character. We often hear talk about democratic culture. You need people who believe in the ideals of democracy to be the representatives or participants or voters that will actually make this work, that all the goodwill in the world of setting up institutions, an independent judiciary, a separation of powers, a legislature and executive, that they're going to be for naught if you don't have the right attitude and character and culture, and then this sort of idea, I guess, of virtue that comes up in your research too.
So the article that sparked this discussion is an article co-written by Simon Kennedy and myself. Simon's a political historian. And what sparked the idea for that paper was a quote from Quentin Skinner, so a leading historian of political thought in the 20th century. And he said there are two main ways of thinking about the well-functioning of polities. One is an institutional model that says if we get the institutions right, everything else will follow. And the other view is one that says virtue so virtue and the character of the people is really important. So no matter how you design the institutions, if the people that actually occupy positions of power, and the people who vote those people in are not virtuous or don't want to do the right thing, then no matter what you put in the Constitution or the documents, that won't function correctly. And it seems to me that the dominant model for thinking about the Australian Constitution, especially in constitutional scholarship, is the institutional model. And so we've got to get the institutions right, and it's all about legal reforms. And if there are any problems that have arisen, say, in the 20th century, whether that be the rise of disciplined political parties, whether it be the 1975 crisis, well, the problem must be an institutional one. And so the tendency has been to blame the framers for not foreseeing those problems and guarding against them in the Constitution. And the solution is to propose legal reforms. So let's reform the Constitution, let's amend the Constitution to prevent political parties or prevent a Governor-General from sacking a sitting Prime Minister or things like that. That's very much an institutional model of thinking about our system. But when we went back and read the convention debates and looked at the ideas the framers had, it's a very different model. So their view was not that institutional design doesn't matter, we need to design our institutions as best we can, but in practice how it functions will depend on the people and the people that they vote in and actually exercise power under those structures. It's a very different model of thinking about politics.
Yeah, and it has its origins in quite early history, doesn't it? This sort of idea of virtue around political leaders and the character required to make political systems work. Can you explain the origins of this concept a bit more?
So it goes back most famously to Aristotle, and his model was that the best form of life is to achieve human flourishing, and part of that is to exercise virtue. And so a city-state won't function well unless the citizens are virtuous. And it was the role of the polis, the city-state, to enable human flourishing, including virtue. So the role of the city-state was to promote virtue, not just property and material welfare. That was then Christianised and adopted in the medieval period by Christian thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. And so you have this elaborate metaphysical underpinning drawn from Aristotle as well as the medieval scholastics. But the idea is that you can't separate politics and virtue, but they're inherently connected. If you want a virtuous citizenry, you need the government or the civil government to promote that. And if you want the civil government to function well, you need virtue both in those who exercise power and also in the people.
And what does virtue mean? I mean, there's a dictionary definition, but how do you unpack it in that context? Were there characteristics that were considered virtuous and characteristics were considered less virtuous?
So I guess the core definition is acting in accordance with our end or purpose, or our created nature under the Christian articulation of that. And there were 4 cardinal virtues: justice, temperance, fortitude, and prudence, wisdom. And then that, again, with the Christianised version, that was the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity were added. The idea is that we're acting in accordance with our created nature. So there's a teleological or metaphysical underpinning to that, which gradually began to get lost. As we move into the 19th century with modern thought, a lot of those metaphysical ideas were gotten rid of and no longer seen as viable in the modern scientific and enlightened age. And that means that we still want to hang on to those ideas of virtue and acting wisely and acting well, but a lot of the underlying theological justifications for those have been cut away. And so there's a secularisation of those ideas. And that's when it transforms into the idea of character.
Before we get on to character, though, as someone else in history who talked about virtue, who shifted a little bit from the classical and the Christian conceptions, which was, of course, the great Italian political strategist, Niccolo Machiavelli, he talked about bravery, skill, forcefulness and willingness to do evil when necessary was still a virtue. So, that sort of development of the concept of virtue, that the ends are justifying the means in the Machiavelli sense.
So I'm a constitutional lawyer and I co-wrote this article with Simon Kennedy, who's a historian of political thought.
Yeah.
He wrote the section on that and he has much more expertise and knowledge about those things. But my understanding is that Machiavelli's view is a kind of bastardisation of the term virtue. So he still uses the term virtue, but it's got kind of more to do with maintaining political power and doing those things that are necessary to maintain one's position rather than acting in accordance with an objective standard which binds all people.
Well, it's James Madison, US founding father, said the common good of society. It's sort of benevolence around but of course it's what you deem the common good of society, which then brings into question the subjectiveness of the virtue. But as you say, we shift in the 19th century from virtue to talking about character. How are they different? I can imagine how they are different, but give me your interpretation, Ben.
I think it's a similar idea, but the underlying theological and metaphysical foundation is gone. So it's a secularization of that idea. And then it's also re-articulated then in the concept of modern political liberalism. And that's much more individualistic, much more focused on the autonomy of the self. These are ideals of independence, particularly for members of parliament. So members of parliament should be independent, not be swayed or not be controlled by other influences which dictate their vote. There are ideals of manliness and progress. So the strong man who is independent and a self-actualizing kind of concept. So doing the right thing, doing good, still within the sense of a shared moral compass within society, but allied to those ideas of independence, manliness.
Why did it become increasingly secular, this idea of character and, you're wanting people of good character rather than bad character to be in public life? In the 19th century, people are identifying as Christian in the Australian colonies. So whether you were a Catholic or a Protestant, you were by and large a Christian, and yet the discourse is distinctly secular compared to its antecedents.
Yeah, so you're right. I think there is still a widely held Christian consensus within society, but there are lots of currents going on underneath the surface which weaken confidence in various Christian ideas. So, for example, the rise of Darwinism, that really shatters or challenges the idea of an inherent human nature with the metaphysical underpinnings of older Christian thought. There's much more exposure, I think, to diverse cultures, which might weaken confidence in any sense of universal human nature or morality. So again, I think you're right that it's certainly Australia in the 19th century was a largely Christian culture and shared beliefs in Christian morality, for example, but a weakening of various aspects of Christian doctrine as well.
Yeah, I mean, in Australian debates, when you talk about people of good character, there's a sense that they work hard, so they're not lazy, that they're brave, they're courageous, that they have a level of self-control, so they don't let themselves go, they're not drunken or disorderly, they tell the truth, they're gentle and cheerful, they have practical wisdom. I mean, a lot of these sentiments or characteristics, I should say, are linked to the ideal Australian of that era, I presume, that, what's the sort of the ideal Australian man, because these are manly character traits too, the sort of the strength and courage, working to provide for your family. How do you see them manifesting in our constitutional debates that are to come in the late 19th century?
So by the time you get to the 1890s, when the convention debates were held and the framers drafted and debated the terms of the Constitution, so I think there's still a widely held assumption of a Christian society and Christian morality, but it is also very pragmatic, and so it's not strongly ideological. And so the Christianity doesn't seem to strongly influence, for example, the way they thought about law or a constitution. So it's in there, the reference to Almighty God, but that's largely a pragmatic response to the churches sending in petitions and campaigning for that, rather than any deep-seated conviction that we need to acknowledge God in the Constitution. So there's still a widespread consensus on Christian morality, perhaps a loss of confidence in some of the underpinning foundations, and also a lack of directly influencing the way they thought about concrete things.
And what about the concept of race? The Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, their first act was the Immigration Restriction Act, which implemented the White Australia policy, bipartisan support, although, the concept of parties we'll talk about later on whether that was seen as good or a bad thing. But, I mean, race was a big issue for us in the 19th century and really the first half of the 20th century.
Yes, the White Australia policy, I guess, is about maintaining the purity of the nation of Australia. And so other cultures and races, I guess, are seen as less civilised or less advanced. So the idea was to preserve the purity of that culture. And that probably ties in with the themes we've been talking about. If you want a virtuous society and virtuous people, we need people who share the same set of values and cultural backgrounds. If we start bringing in a whole lot of people from different cultures, then they would have thought that might upset that balance and that shared consensus. So I think that's partly related to ideas of virtue and the functioning of the constitutional system.
Yeah, I mean, Charles Pearson wrote an influential book in 1893, National Life and Character, which suggested an influx of servile, his words, Asians would undermine the moral independence on which democracy, and I guess Australian democracy, depended. This idea that we needed Australians of good character who were independent, courageous, hardworking, gentle, cheerful, you name it, but that other cultures, other races didn't have those characteristics that were necessary for the functioning of Australian democracy.
And Pearson was a Liberal, so it shows how widespread those ideas are across the political spectrum at the time.
So in the constitutional conventions, of course, Australia's founding fathers were very interested in what had happened in the United States and the debates and outcomes of their own drafting of their constitution. How did they view their American counterparts?
So one of the books that was very influential in the framers was James Bryce's book, The American Commonwealth. And so Bryce was a British Viscount, and he'd spent time in the States observing political life there. And the main thing that comes out of his book is that the system of party had completely dominated all aspects of the political system. And that was, in fact, contrary to the intentions of the framers and the founders in America. So they had intended that factions would not dominate, but in practice that had been the case. And so the key lesson that Bryce drew was that no matter how we draft the Constitution, in fact, the way it works in practice will depend on the character of the people. And so that was the main lesson that Bryce drew, and that was very influential on the framers. So when they're thinking about what is it that a constitution can do, what is it that it can't do, that was a key lesson. So there's a limited ability to constrain the future because that will depend upon the people.
And what about the type of people who would enter politics? There was a concern, wasn't there? James Bryce had a concern that not necessarily the best and brightest were the ones who ended up in politics.
Indeed, because the party leaders tended to dictate and control everything, so there was limited ability as a politician to achieve anything great. So it tended not to attract the best and the brightest, as you mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, how did this come up in our constitutional conventions, the James Bryce's, the American Commonwealth? Did they reference it heavily? Did they say this is a salutary tale, let's avoid some of these warnings? Or were they quite accepting that they just get the mechanics right and then the rest is down to what sort of culture we end up having and the people we end up raising to be part of politics?
So it came up quite a lot. It was a very influential text, and it came up in terms of institutional design. So when they're designing the institutions and incorporating those into the Constitution, it also was influential in providing the background principles for how they thought about what a constitution is and what it's doing. And so there were examples, or there were debates and proposals in the convention debates, for example, to adopt the Swiss form of government. So let's abandon the Westminster system. That's proven, some argued, that's proven to be full of problems. Parties dominate. They could see parties on the horizon. So in the 1890s, the Labor Party was just beginning to form and win seats in the New South Wales Parliament, and it was become stunningly successful in the early 1900s. And so some were warning about this pernicious effect of parties coming. And so some were saying, let's try and deal with that, prevent parties from arising. And so the majority draw on Bryce, and they said, well, no matter how we draft the Constitution, the way it works in practice will depend on the people and their representatives. So it formed their ideas of constitutional humility. So as to what is it that a constitution can actually achieve and what can't it achieve.
So tell me about this Swiss system that we might otherwise have ended up with.
So the idea there is that rather than the ministry being formed by cabinets from one party, the Parliament would individually elect ministers to be heads of departments for a fixed period, say a year. And then so each minister will be elected on merit, not based on party affiliation. So I think that was the key idea. And the idea there was to try and break the stranglehold of party.
And the Prime Minister of Switzerland, I assume it's a Prime Minister. I must say I show my ignorance of their political system entirely. How were they selected? From the Parliament, by the Parliament?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. But in the end, people are humans and they have their philosophical tendencies, their personal relationships. So they'll, end up factionalising and clubbing together, even if there's no perfect political party with an organisational structure outside of the Parliament. So, even in Switzerland, I presume the parties have evolved, even if it's the Parliament that remains sovereign in that decision-making around who runs a government department or not.
I'm sure that's the case. And one of the key issues is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah.
And some might say it's a bad thing. We don't want people clubbing together. But on the other hand, if you want to get things done, parties are a means of common action, common cause. So people who share similar beliefs and have similar policy goals can join together and be more effective in achieving those goals. So not all the framers were opposed to parties. They weren't seen as pernicious, but seen as necessary to provide stability, and it's part of the fight and fire of political life. is to have parties based on different opinions and views.
Do you think the framers would have expected the party system to have been as strong as it has been? I mean, we've had a very, very pervasive two-party system. I mean, the Liberal Party, for example, was only formed in 1944. So if we say that in terms of stable two parties, for 82 years we have had a Liberal Party and a Labor Party who have shared the spoils of government, interchangeably, with the Liberals, of course, mainly in coalition with the Country Party and their National Party as it changed. But, I mean, would the framers have thought that was expected, or do you think they would have been surprised at how pervasive the two-party system has been in Australia?
So in the 1890s, when the framers were drafting the Constitution, I think they were largely still operating on the model of the mid-19th century British model of there are parties that exist, they're relatively stable, but they're not the disciplined parties that we have today. So it's a very different understanding of party. They thought the parties were essential to the functioning of parliamentary government, but again, a very different model of what parties were than what we have today. Having said that, though, the Labor Party was organising and becoming very successful and enforcing the pledge, and so it was becoming very disciplined. So it was certainly on the horizon. Whether the framers should have been able to predict in the future, I don't think they would have said that's their business to prophesy about what the future would hold.
It was interesting, though, the Labor Party of the 1890s was not particularly supportive of the Constitution as it was being drafted. So you could argue that this Constitution really is a result of those who were not Labor. And there's a sort of an analysis that it's then been Labor Party, Labor Party MPs, but, Labor Prime Ministers who have been the ones to attempt to reform the Constitution, which has, of course, been incredibly difficult given the high bar that's set to amend it, because there's a level of dissatisfaction with the system that we were delivered finally in 1901 that was implemented.
Sure, so that's certainly a strong narrative in some parts, that the Constitution represents capitalism and money and the established order, and the Labor Party is often dissatisfied and trying to push the limits of that constitutional system, which it has done, I guess, in many ways.
The other idea, which is an idea put forward by British politician and philosopher Edmund Burke, that parliamentarians should have this independence of thought, of judgment. They're elected, but they're elected to then exercise their own judgment rather than as a kind of a cipher of the electorate that's put them there. That, of course, is a view that sort of predates the prevalence of political parties. But do you think our founding fathers had that in mind, that every individual parliamentarian elected should be coming with, okay, they might have a political party backing them, but in the end they should be exercising a level of judgment independent of those external influences?
I think that's right. So there was certainly a strong view in parliamentary government in Australia that members should be independent. You also get the idea of responsibility, and responsibility is kind of a synonym for accountability. And so that was a very strong view as well, so that the parliamentarians had a level of independence to exercise their judgment in enacting legislation and formulating policy. And they were responsible to the people for doing that. And so the people could exert their influence on Parliament, and that would influence the executive. And so there was never a pure independence where they could just make decisions in a vacuum. They were always accountable to the people and accountable to the electorate, who were their ultimate masters. So it's always a balance between what is the level of independence that's necessary to make decisions on their merits, but also being sensitive to the wishes of the people.
This idea of responsible government, that our executive is elected of the Parliament, it's our system, it's the British system, but then we obviously have aspects of the American system in our what was it? What do you call it? Washminster system.
Washminster mutation. Yeah.
The Washminster mutation. So why did we choose responsible government and not a separate executive like they have in the United States?
So there was never really any serious doubt that we would adopt the British model. So as I said, there were proposals to adopt the Swiss system, which is a modification. But for the majority view, it was very much that they wanted to follow the British model of constitutionalism. And both because it was familiar and it was known in the colonies, they'd been using it since the 1850s.
Did they think it was superior?
And also because it was inherent merits, for sure.
Yeah.
And so things like ensuring stability with the executive, enabling Parliament to pass legislation, and that sense of responsibility as well was considered very important. So it was inherently superior. So, for example, in the United States, where presidents are elected for a 4-year term, it's difficult to exercise that accountability, whereas under the Westminster model, if the executive is significantly out of step with the wishes of the electorate, they can make their feelings known on Parliament, who can then hold the executive to account. So that was the view, that was much more indirectly, but much more ability for the electorate to make their wishes known and hold the executive to account.
And what was the idea, I guess, of the operation of parliamentary business then, and of course formation of the government from the parliament? Was there an expectation that parliamentarians would have some level of independence of thought and judgment and voting habits?
Yes, for sure, certainly compared to today. But there were lots of reforms in the late 19th century. And the problem, you're balancing a couple of things there. One is that independence is a good thing. Each member of parliament should exercise his judgment impartially and do what he thinks is right. And yet, on the other hand, too much independence leads to instability and the destruction of parliamentary time. So if too many members are independent and they're stymieing debate, that can freeze up parliamentary business and make things unworkable. And so there's that constant tension between those two things. And I think certainly towards the end of the 19th century, it was moving much more in favour of the party system and towards the interests of government. So government business began to predominate over individual business. Government would take most of the time. And so there's certainly a diminishing of independence in that pure mid-19th century sense.
It's interesting. Alfred Deakin, who becomes, of course, one of our early prime ministers, declared that our form of government is not susceptible of continuous or successful working without parties. I had to read this about 10 times because of the double negatives, but basically we need the parties. And during his time, of course, there were the three parties, and they used to say it was like having 3 different cricket teams. It was it was unwieldy, but it sort of worked. But we've obviously moved beyond that. But this, even early on, despite the concerns around political parties, we allowed it to happen. We allowed political parties to predominate, and in fact, Deakin saying we need them to work effectively.
Yeah, and that was a common view. That was the orthodoxy indeed from, say, the mid-19th century, that we need broadly stable groupings of political parties to ensure that stability. Otherwise, parliamentary business becomes unworkable. And it wasn't the same thing as the disciplined parties of today, but at least the majority of MPs in Parliament should be aligned with the party, and that provides stability and enables governments to actually achieve things because they can rely on the backing of the majority of their parties.
Australia obviously has an upper house called the Senate, which is the same name as the United States upper house. Do you think the constitutional framers were aware of the inherent contradiction between the responsible government model of our lower house, our House of Representatives, and the power of the Senate and what it could do?
For sure. So one of the framers, Hackett, famously said, if we incorporate federalism in responsible government, either federalism will kill responsible government or responsible government will kill federalism. So these are two incompatible principles, and if we mash them together in the Constitution, we're going to set up tensions for the future. So they for sure thought that was a problem, but that was the price of federation. For the smaller colonies, they said, we're not going to enter federation, not sign on to the Constitution, unless you guarantee that in the Senate we're equally represented and the Senate has coordinate powers to that of the House of Representatives. So they were aware that there's a ticking time bomb there, but that was the price of federation for the smaller colonies. And
do you think he was right? I mean, I'd say that responsible government has killed federation more than federation has killed responsible government. But, I mean, you may have a different view. I don't think a federation is the power of the states is through various high court decisions, but also by the states ceding quite a bit of power has ended up being much diminished compared to what the constitutional draftsman would have thought. And that sort of idea that the Senate is a states' house that will stand up for states' rights. I mean, the party system puts paid to that, doesn't it?
Yeah, so the intention was that the Senate would function as a states' house and then guarantee the interests of the states through its voting patterns. But there was also a recognition that the states' house, the Senate, would also be elected and fall along party lines. So individual MPs wouldn't automatically support their own state interests, but they were, as part of political parties, they would be bound to follow the wishes of that party as well. So there was a recognition even early on that the Senate wouldn't be a pure states house, would have to take into account other considerations. Certainly under the model of responsible government that we've got, the Commonwealth has vastly grown from what it was originally intended to be, and the states have diminished. So responsible government appears largely to have killed federalism, at least in terms of the powers of the Senate.
Even in the United Kingdom, the House of Lords is a much weaker chamber than the House of Commons. So you would have thought that there was some foresight on the part of our founding fathers that would be inevitable in Australia, would you not? Or do you think through the structure they settled on that they wouldn't have foreseen how weak the Senate has become compared to the reps and the government?
Well, their view is that the House of Lords and the Senate were entirely different beasts. So the House of Lords is weak because it's not representative. And so if the House of Commons pushes and insists, the House of Lords will have to give way. That wasn't the view that the framers had. They thought that because the Senate is representative and if it has a strong backing from the people, it can stand its ground. So its powers, I think, have remained much stronger than the House of Lords. But what I should have said before is its representative basis is much different from what the framers intended. So it's much more, as you say, along party lines than it is along the lines of states' rights.
I guess the Senate has maintained a strong influence when the government of the day hasn't had the balance of power, and so then independent senators have an outsized level of negotiating power over the legislative agenda of the government of the day.
Yeah, so one view is that we get the best of both worlds. We have a stable government for the most part in the lower house, formed by strong and disciplined political parties, and we have the ability, at least, for greater representation in the Senate of different opinions and views through minority parties being elected. And it doesn't jeopardise the stability of government, but allows a greater level of representation.
When it comes to the 1975 dismissal of Gough Whitlam as Prime Minister by the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, I mean, a lot of analysis will say it was a constitutional crisis, our greatest constitutional crisis. Another analysis is that it was a political crisis. The Constitution worked just fine. Rules weren't broken. And we ended up with an interim Prime Minister, but an election was called and duly held, and a new Prime Minister was elected with a very large majority in the reps. How do you see 1975 in terms of this sort of idea of character? Parliamentarians and office holders, and of course, head of the representative of the head of state in the Governor General.
Yeah, so much has been made of that.
Yeah.
And a lot of the constitutional literature is very critical of what happened and very critical of the framers. So we've got this problem, this crisis, and it must be traced to institutional reasons. So the design of the Constitution is imperfect, and the framers muffed up by not preventing against this. And so the solution is, let's amend the Constitution and let's stop this happening again. One issue, as you mentioned, is just how serious was this? I think overall our system has been very stable. And if this is the most serious blip in 126 years, then we're probably doing okay. But the framers' view would have been not so much to look at the institutional design or criticise the framework itself, but to look at the actors involved and see where the problems were there. So, for example, to look at the leader of the opposition and to see whether his actions were driven by political motives or improper in some way, or to look at the Governor-General, or even to look at the government. Maybe the actions they took triggered or precipitated the crisis. So it's not so much about the institutional design, but to look at the actions of the people at the time and see how they triggered and led to the crisis.
Do you think it's a surprise that it took till 1975 to have such a crisis?
Well, if that's the worst that's happened in 126 years, we're probably doing okay.
Yeah.
Given how people thought this was a ticking time bomb that's going to derail our system, if that's the worst that's happened, I think we're doing okay.
Well, debates around who was in the wrong in that situation or whether anyone was in the wrong run to this day. And, of course, we had the 50th anniversary of it last year, so there was a lot of discussion. If the framers of our Constitution were conscious of the inevitability of the evolution and so, therefore, the pointlessness of trying to mitigate unforeseen events or negative developments, that actually the Parliament would sort it out and that was appropriate, do you think they would be disappointed then at the rigidity of our Constitution, that we've only had 8 successful referenda in our 125-year history of the Commonwealth?
Yeah, so some of the framers, for example, William Treneth, And Higgins, I think, wanted much greater ability to amend the Constitution in a formal sense. So that it was the people of the time, they're the present possessors of sovereign power. They should be able to amend and change their Constitution. But that wasn't the majority view. So the framers, as a majority, said, this is a Constitution that we're forming as a covenant, as an agreement between the colonies, and it shouldn't be easily amended. And so I think they would think that their views have been vindicated. By making it deliberately difficult, I mean, what's the point of a constitution if you can just amend it easily like legislation? It kind of ceases to be a constitution. But also, constitutional change in a formal sense is not the only way that a constitutional system can change. We've seen vast changes in our political system from the Federation period to now. So back in 1900, when the Constitution came into effect, there were a handful of government departments, a few thousand employees. So it was very small, whereas today we have an enormous bureaucracy, we have independent statutory agencies, officers, all sorts of things. And that has all happened, those enormous changes have happened within the constraints of the Constitution that we have. And so I think they would think that the wisdom of their document has been vindicated by the history. So that their Constitution sets out the framework, the foundational principles, but it allows enormous flexibility and change in terms of the way we govern ourselves.
Do you think too that the High Court has ended up being the embodiment of that British tradition of constitutional adaptability then?
For sure. So in the way that it has interpreted various things, it's enabled that flexibility in lots of ways. So rather than constraining the situation of the executive, it's enabled flexibility in government departments and the way things are structured. So it has tried to be consistent with that view, I think, in lots of ways.
And do you think that's been a good thing? I mean, it's the interpretation of the external affairs power, which basically means the government can sign a treaty and can actually have quite an impact on, say, areas that would be the prerogative of the states. And yet, because we've signed an international commitment, therefore, under the external affairs power, where federal government can intervene in areas that the state should have. I mean, that's quite a massive expansion in the power of the federal government at the expense of the states. I think there's an argument that that's way beyond what the founding fathers would have envisaged.
So I think it's inevitable and also desirable that there be some change. Obviously, we don't live in the same society as in 1900, and there are going to have to be some changes. And so lots of changes are desirable and necessary. And again, the best example I can think of is the structure of the executive. So the way the government is structured is going to reflect a much greater expectation that people have of government intervention in various things, welfare, national disability insurance scheme. So it's inevitable that you'll have changes in those regard. That doesn't mean that the federal balance of power, I think, is also really important and needs to be respected. So you're right that the interpretation of the external affairs power has enabled the Commonwealth to move into areas that would never have been part of the intention of the framers to allow that. To what extent is that a good thing? That's, I guess, a matter of debate. But it's certainly at odds with what the framers intended and the federal distribution of power as contained in the Constitution itself.
And I think it sometimes challenges the trust in our democracy and our institutions that the international can override the national or the local, local government or state government desires, and that Australia should have some sort of sovereign right to make decisions about what happens on our territory to our own people, or within a state context, what happens within the borders of that state. And I think the aspirations of that sort of liberal international system are all very well and good in the 20th century, but its 21st century manifestation is to be found wanting. And you just look at the populations around the world who are really sort of pushing back against that liberal international order.
What it also leads to is multiple overlapping levels of legislation on similar topics. So we have Victorian and state legislation about discrimination, about vilification, about hate speech. We now have federal legislation dealing with similar issues. It's very unclear what law applies and how it applies, and so whether the federal overrides the state. So it can be very unclear in some cases just what the law is, given the multiple overlapping levels of legislation on similar or the same topics.
Yes, sometimes you just think we just need to wipe it all out and start again. But anyway, Ben, what are the lessons of all this today? I mean, we have a multicultural society. It's a pluralist society, very, very different from Australia in 1901. There's an idea that we don't want to impose uniformity across society. We allow people with different religious practices, value systems to thrive and flourish here with an expectation of a level of tolerance. How do we maintain that strength of character that our founding fathers thought was essential to make our democracy thrive in the midst of all this pluralism?
That's a great question. How do we fix Australia?
Just an easy one to end on, Ben.
That's right. So one of the things our paper was trying to do was to examine the political ideas underlying the drafting of our constitution. Another purpose was to illustrate another way of doing things, or another way of looking at politics. So rather than looking to institutions and laws to fix all our problems, maybe there's another way. And so the dominant model today tends to be, there's a problem, let's legislate. Or there's a machete attack, let's ban machetes. So there's constant stream of legislation trying to fix our problems, but never really getting there. And so one question is, we've gotten rid of any sense of shared moral standards or objective beliefs about morality. One question is that in fact stable? We get rid of that and expect people to behave well. We don't have any higher standard to appeal to. So that's the question, I think. Is that a stable situation? Just to take no position on what's true or right and expect people to behave well.
And I guess if you had a Christian interpretation of this, you would say that this is a result of an over-secularisation of Australian society, that we don't have an overarching sense of God's will or, following the model of Jesus and his love and forgiveness and compassion. And so for a Christian audience, that might be the solution, is to reintroduce more kind of religious elements into the development of moral character and the development of a sort of a sense of what it is to be a virtuous Australian and what are Australian values.
Sure, so maybe our public institutions need to take a stand on what is true and what is moral and what is right. But I'll put it slightly differently, and I would say it illustrates a key proposition of Christian teaching, which is that laws can't actually change the heart. So they can help deal with these issues in some way, but they can't actually fix the real problem, which is the human heart. Only the gospel, only Jesus Christ can.
Good note to end on, Ben. Thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.